The ultimate battlefield of the Cold War was not a geographical territory or a technological frontier, but the human soul itself, a fundamental clash between a civilization that placed "in God we trust" on its currency and a regime that viewed faith as a poisonous relic to be systematically uprooted from the mind of the masses in the United States. The First Amendment created a radical sanctuary for religious expression, ensuring that the state could neither establish a national religion nor prohibit the free exercise of any faith. This legal framework fostered a vibrant, pluralistic landscape where churches, synagogues, and mosques were not just places of worship, but the moral and social bedrock of the community, independent of government control. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was the world's first state dedicated to the total elimination of religion, founded on the Marxist-Leninist doctrine that religion is the opium of the people. The state did not merely separate church and state. It declared a war on God, utilizing the full power of the KGB, the educational system, and the League of Militant Atheists to humiliate believers, destroy historical cathedrals, and replace ancient spiritual rituals with hollow, state-mandated secular ceremonies. This contrast, the right to believe versus the duty to deny, created two entirely different spiritual realities, one of public devotion and one of secret, whispered prayers in the dark. And if you watch this entire series, you will understand how the Soviet attempt to kill the divine only created a spiritual vacuum that eventually swallowed the state itself. The role of the house of worship as a community center versus a state warehouse highlights the physical erasure of faith. In the U.S., the local church was often the most beautiful and well-maintained building in town, a symbol of community pride and private investment, where citizens gathered not only for prayer, but for charity, education, and social support, free from the prying eyes of the state. In the USSR, thousands of historic churches, mosques, and synagogues were dynamited or desecrated, transformed into grain silos, warehouses, or, most cynically, museums of scientific atheism, where the sacred artifacts of faith were displayed as primitive superstitions to be mocked by school tours. The state viewed every church dome as a rival to the Kremlin, a physical reminder of a power higher than the party. And its destruction was a calculated act of psychological warfare intended to show the populace that God was dead and only the state remained. The American citizen saw the church as a sign of life and continuity. The Soviet citizen saw the ruins of a cathedral as a sign of the state's absolute, crushing power over the past and the future, a visual trauma that defined the landscape of the socialist paradise. The contrast in the legal and social status of the believer was a daily test of courage. In the U.S., religious affiliation was a private matter that carried no legal penalty and often provided a social advantage. With political leaders frequently invoking faith to build trust and consensus, the American system viewed religious pluralism as a source of national strength. In the USSR, being an open believer was an act of political suicide, while the Soviet Constitution technically guaranteed freedom of worship. The reality was a system of systematic discrimination where believers were barred from higher education, denied promotions, and subjected to public comradely courts of humiliation. The state treated the religious person not as a citizen with a different opinion, but as a socially alien element, a potential saboteur of the socialist future, forcing millions into a life of spiritual double-speak, where they would publicly affirm atheism at the factory while secretly baptizing their children in a bathroom at midnight. The American believer stood tall in the light of the First Amendment. The Soviet believer lived in a state of permanent internal exile, knowing that a single misplaced word about their faith could result in the loss of their livelihood or their freedom. The indoctrination of children and the betrayal of the family was the most sinister front of the Soviet anti-religious campaign. In the U.S., parents possessed the absolute legal right to raise their children in their own faith, with Sunday schools and religious education being a standard part of the American upbringing, protected from state interference. In the USSR, the state viewed the child as a future atheist soldier of the revolution, and the school system was the primary tool for deprogramming children from their parents. Religious superstitions. Children were encouraged to join the Young Pioneers and the Komsomol, where they were taught to mock religion and, in extreme cases, were pressured to denounce their own parents to the authorities for practicing faith at home. This state-sponsored wedge between parent and child was a profound violation of the human family. Turning the home into a place of suspicion and fear, the American child learned the 10 Commandments. The Soviet child learned that there is no God, only the party. A psychological conditioning that aimed to create a new generation of Soviet men who had no memory of the sacred, a goal that required the total destruction of the spiritual bond between generations. The ultimate contrast lay in the treatment of religious leadership in the underground church. In the U.S., priests, pastors, and rabbis were independent leaders who often acted as a moral conscience for the nation, frequently challenging the government on issues of civil rights and social justice. Their authority derived from their flock, not the state. In the USSR, the state attempted to either liquidate religious leaders or turn them into KGB agents. Thousands of clergy were executed or sent to the Gulag during the Great Terror, and those who remained were forced into registered churches that were strictly monitored and often infiltrated by the secret police to ensure their sermons remained politically loyal. This forced the true life of faith into the catacomb church, a clandestine network of secret meetings in private apartments, hidden forced baptisms, and hand-copied scripture. Where the act of worship was a high-stakes criminal offense, the American believer looked to their pastor for guidance. The Soviet believer looked at the official priest with suspicion, searching for the unofficial faith that the KGB could not capture, a spiritual resistance that proved that the more the state tried to crush the soul, the more it retreated into a place where no commissar could ever follow. The psychological war within the Soviet educational system was designed to create a new Soviet man, entirely devoid of spiritual DNA, a goal that required the aggressive state-sponsored bullying of religious children. In the United States, the school was a neutral ground where a student's faith was respected as a private family matter, and the presence of diverse religious clubs and voluntary prayer reflected a society that valued the moral foundation of belief. Even in secular institutions, for the Soviet student, the classroom was a front line of atheistic combat, where teachers were mandated to identify believing families and subject their children to public ridicule. These children were often forced to stand before their peers while teachers mocked their primitive views or were pressured to remove crosses and religious symbols under the threat of failing grades or expulsion. The state utilized the pioneer and Komsomol organizations to replace the vacuum of faith with a secular cult of the state, where Lenin was portrayed as an eternal, godlike figure, and the Communist Manifesto served as a rigid, infallible scripture. The American student was encouraged to find strength in their faith. The Soviet student was taught that their faith was a mental illness and a betrayal of the scientific future, a form of ideological child abuse that forced millions of young souls to choose between their parents' love and the state's approval, creating a generation of internal immigrants who learned to lie about their deepest convictions before they could even read. The contrast in religious literature and the war on the word was a struggle for the control of history and morality. In the U.S., the Bible was the most published book in the country, available in every hotel room and bookstore, a symbol of a society where spiritual wisdom was considered a public good and a pillar of literacy. The state had no power to censor religious texts, leading to a vibrant market of theological debate and spiritual exploration. In the USSR, the Bible was effectively a contraband item, its publication strictly limited to tiny, state-controlled editions that were impossible for the average citizen to obtain, and the importation of religious literature from abroad was treated by the KGB as ideological sabotage, punishable by years in the Gulag. This created a desperate, underground market for Samizdat-scripture, where believers would spend months hand-copying the Gospels or the Quran on thin tissue paper to be shared in secret. The American believer took the availability of the word for granted. The Soviet believer risked their life to own a single, tattered page of a prayer book, proving that the state's greatest fear was not an armed uprising, but the quiet, private reading of a text that claimed a power higher than the general secretary, a spiritual hunger that no amount of Marxist-Leninist pamphlets could ever satisfy. The role of science as a weapon against the soul defined the intellectual dishonesty of the Soviet anti-religious campaign. The Soviet state promoted scientific atheism not as a philosophical choice, but as an absolute, proven fact of biology and physics, utilizing the prestige of the space race and technological progress to prove that God did not exist because Gagarin went to space and didn't see him. This primitive materialism was used to frame believers not just as wrong, but as anti-scientific and therefore enemies of progress. In the US, science and religion were generally viewed as complementary or at least separate spheres of human experience, with many of the greatest American scientists and astronauts being openly devout men of faith who saw no contradiction between the laboratory and the chapel. The American system allowed for a complex, nuanced understanding of the universe. The Soviet system used science as a crude ideological hammer, forcing every scientist to publicly affirm atheism or face the end of their career, a policy that stifled genuine intellectual inquiry and turned the pursuit of truth into a servant of the party's dogma, ensuring that in the USSR, science was just another name for state-mandated ignorance regarding the mysteries of existence. The desecration of rituals and the red weddings was a calculated attempt to colonize the most intimate moments of human life. The Soviet state understood that birth, marriage, and death were the traditional strongholds of the church, so it attempted to replace them with hollow, socialist rites. Instead of a baptism, the state promoted Octobering, where the child was dedicated to the revolution. Instead of a church wedding, the state built palaces of weddings where the ceremony was a bureaucratic transaction overseen by a portrait of Lenin. And instead of a religious funeral, the state enforced secular burials that focused on the deceased's contribution to the collective rather than the fate of their soul. In the US, these milestones were sacred, private events protected by the community and the law, providing a sense of eternal meaning and family continuity that the state could not touch. The American marriage was a covenant before God. The Soviet marriage was a contract before the committee, a difference that stripped the most profound human experiences of their spiritual weight and turned the life cycle into a series of political check-ins, leaving the Soviet citizen with a profound sense of spiritual emptiness that no palace of culture could ever fill. The final, terrifying contrast lay in the treatment of religious dissent and the martyrs of the Gulag. While the US was a refuge for those fleeing religious persecution from around the world, the USSR was a factory of martyrs from the 1920s to the 1980s. The Soviet state systematically imprisoned, tortured, and executed hundreds of thousands of bishops, priests, mullahs, and ordinary believers whose only crime was the refusal to renounce their faith. The KGB maintained a dedicated church department to monitor every prayer and infiltrate every congregation, treating the underground catacomb church as a terrorist organization. The American believer exercised their faith as a fundamental right. The Soviet believer practiced their faith as an act of revolutionary defiance, knowing that their devotion could lead to the loss of their children, their home, or their life. This persistent, hidden faith, maintained in the face of absolute state terror, was the ultimate proof that the Soviet project had failed. For even with total control over the media, the schools, and the police, the state could not conquer the silent, inner sanctuary of the human heart, a spiritual fortress that eventually outlasted the empire of atheism. The survival of faith in the shadows and the catacomb church was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against a totalizing state, while the American believer could walk into a cathedral on a Sunday morning with a sense of social belonging and legal safety. The Soviet believer was forced to transform their home into a clandestine sanctuary. In the USSR, the true life of the church didn't happen under the golden domes that the state allowed to remain open for foreign tourists, but in cramped Khrushchevka apartments, in forests during the dead of night, and in the soundless whispers of the Gulag barracks. These secret communities, often led by underground priests who worked ordinary factory jobs by day, created a parallel spiritual universe that the KGB struggled to fully penetrate. The act of secret baptism became a high-stakes operation involving trusted lookouts and muffled voices, a direct defiance of the state's claim to own the child's soul. In the U.S., religion was a public pillar of society. In the USSR, it was a spiritual resistance movement, with a simple act of wearing a hidden cross or reciting a prayer, with a radical rejection of the party's monopoly on truth. A hidden fire that no amount of state-mandated atheism could ever fully extinguish. The contrast in religious holidays and the war on Christmas, or rather, the war on the calendar, was a struggle for the rhythm of human life. In the US, holidays like Christmas, Easter, and Passover were not just religious events, but national milestones that shaped the economy, the culture, and the family structure, with the government recognizing the importance of these days for the collective well-being. In the USSR, the state attempted to physically erase the religious calendar, converting Christmas into the festival of the New Year and replacing the Star of Bethlehem with the Red Star of the Kremlin. The Grandfather Frost, Dead Moros, was weaponized as a secular substitute for St. Nicholas, and the state organized mandatory subbotniks, unpaid workdays, on Easter Sunday to prevent people from attending church services. This aggressive secularization of time was an attempt to make the citizen forget the sacred cycles of their ancestors and replace them with the sterile anniversaries of the revolution. The American holiday was a celebration of eternal values. The Soviet holiday was a mobilization of the masses, a difference that left the Soviet citizen feeling like a cog in a machine that never stopped to acknowledge the soul's need for transcendence and rest. The role of religion as a catalyst for civil rights and dissent created a massive strategic advantage for the U.S. that the Soviet state could never replicate. In the United States, the Black Church was the very womb of the civil rights movement, with leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. using the language of the Bible to challenge the nation's conscience and demand justice, proving that faith could be a powerful engine for social evolution and democratic reform. The American system, despite its flaws, allowed the church to act as a moral mirror to the state. In the USSR, any religious leader who attempted to advocate for social justice or human rights was immediately branded a CIA agent or a religious extremist and disappeared into a psychiatric hospital or a labor camp. The state's total control over religious organizations ensured that the church could never be a platform for reform, only for forced compliance or silent martyrdom. The American church helped the nation grow. The Soviet state's crushing of the church ensured that the nation remained stagnant, frozen in an ideological ice age where no moral challenge to the party's power was permitted to exist. The infiltration of the registered church and the betrayal of the pulpit was the KGB's most cynical tool of control. In the U.S., the independence of the clergy was absolute, with the seal of the confessional and the privacy of the pulpit being sacrosanct and protected by law, ensuring that the religious leader remained a trusted confidant for the community. In the USSR, the state created the Council for Religious Affairs, a department of the KGB that vetted every sermon, appointed every bishop, and recruited a vast network of informants within the clergy. Many official priests were forced to report on the confessions of their flock, turning the most sacred act of trust into a trap for the secret police. This systemic corruption of the faith meant that many Soviet citizens viewed the official church with deep suspicion, seeking the true Orthodox or Initiative Baptist, groups that operated entirely in the underground. The American pastor was a shepherd. The Soviet official priest was often a shepherd in a colonel's uniform, a profound desecration of faith that forced the religious life of the nation into a state of permanent, paranoid fragmentation. The ultimate contrast was the "in God we trust" versus "in the party we trust" as the foundation of national morality. The American system was built on the idea that rights are endowed by their creator, meaning they are inherent and cannot be taken away by any government, a philosophy that places a divine limit on state power. In the USSR, the state was the sole source of rights and morality, meaning that whatever the party deemed expedient was moral, and whatever was anti-Soviet was evil. This moral relativism allowed the state to justify the most horrific crimes, from the Holodomor to the Gulag. Because there was no higher law or spiritual authority to which the citizen could appeal, the American citizen possessed a moral compass independent of Washington. The Soviet citizen was expected to have no compass but the party line, a difference that ensured that while the U.S. could survive its mistakes through moral renewal, the Soviet Union was doomed to rot because it had destroyed the very spiritual foundations upon which a just and lasting society must be built. The ultimate failure of the Soviet war on God became undeniable during the system's final decades, as the state discovered that it had successfully destroyed the buildings but failed to extinguish the hunger for the transcendent. In the United States, the 1970s and 80s saw a massive spiritual Great Awakening, with the rise of the evangelical movement and a renewed public focus on faith as a solution to social ills, proving that a free society naturally returns to its moral roots in times of crisis. The Soviet state, despite 70 years of total control over media and education, faced a terrifying spiritual vacuum that was being filled not by Marxist-Leninist fervor, but by a desperate, underground return to ancient traditions and a new, chaotic interest in mysticism. The state had promised a scientific paradise on Earth, but instead delivered a gray, soulless bureaucracy. And when the pressure of the state finally began to ease under glasnost, the first thing that flooded back into the public square was not political debate, but the ringing of church bells and the sight of millions of people openly crossing themselves. The American system thrived by incorporating the divine. The Soviet system collapsed because it tried to replace the eternal with a mortal committee, proving that you can imprison a believer, but you cannot kill the belief that outlives the empire. The contrast in national identity and the divine mission reveals the psychological engine of the two superpowers. For the American, national identity was often tied to the idea of being one nation under God, a concept that provided a sense of purpose and a moral yardstick against which the nation's actions could be measured. This shared spiritual language allowed for national healing and social progress. In the USSR, national identity was forced into a cult of the state, where the party replaced the church and Lenin replaced the Christ. The state demanded a religious level of devotion to a political ideology, creating a society of secular fanatics who eventually became secular cynics. When the promises of the ideology failed to manifest, the American identity was built on an ancient, enduring rock. The Soviet identity was built on a shifting sand of political convenience. And when the ideology failed, the Soviet man was left with nothing: no faith, no tradition, and no moral anchor, leading to a profound national identity crisis that haunts the post-Soviet world to this day. The role of religious organizations in the final collapse of the Iron Curtain was the ultimate irony for the state that tried to erase them. In Poland, the Catholic Church became the backbone of the Solidarity movement. In East Germany, Lutheran churches were the safe havens for the peaceful revolution. And in the USSR, the awakening of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Baltic Catholics, and the Central Asian Muslims became a centrifugal force of liberation. The state had spent decades treating religion as a dead relic, but it was this relic that provided the moral courage for the people to finally say no to the totalitarian machine. The American system understood that a free church is a safety valve for society. The Soviet system turned the church into a coiled spring of resistance, ensuring that when the break finally came, it would be driven by a spiritual energy that the KGB had no weapons to fight. The American citizen used faith to build a better country. The Soviet citizen used faith to dismantle a broken one. The comparison of "In God We Trust" versus atheism as science is a lesson in intellectual humility versus state-mandated arrogance. The American model, by acknowledging a higher power, inherently accepted that human power is limited and fallible, a realization that is the foundation of constitutional democracy and the protection of minority rights. The Soviet model, by elevating the state and its ideology to the level of the absolute, created a system that was incapable of admitting error. Because to admit a mistake was to admit that the infallible science of Marxism-Leninism was wrong. This intellectual rigidity led directly to the Gulag and the total suppression of dissent, as any disagreement was treated as a theological heresy against the state. The American system was built on the right to be wrong in the eyes of the state. The Soviet system was built on the duty to be a slave to the state's current version of the truth, a difference that made one system resilient and the other brittle and destined for the scrap heap of history. The final verdict on the spiritual Cold War is that the American model of religious pluralism and freedom won not because it was holier, but because it was truer to human nature. It recognized that the human soul requires a space that the state cannot fill, a sanctuary of conscience that is the ultimate source of human dignity and liberty. The Soviet experiment was a 70-year attempt to build a heaven on earth by turning the world into a prison, and its failure is the most powerful warning in human history that any state that tries to replace God with the government will eventually end up as a hell for its own people. The American citizen possessed a shield of faith. The Soviet citizen was crushed by the hammer of atheism, and the end of the Cold War was not just a victory of capitalism over socialism, but a victory of the human spirit over the ideological machine. A reminder that the "In God We Trust" on the dollar bill was not just a slogan, but the secret weapon that outlasted the Red Star. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital, or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.